understanding the prototype. We've said that JavaScript implements something called prototypal inheritance. That means that there exists this concept called the prototype. So what is that? Well, in this case, instead of a big word alert, let's show you what we mean. Let's say we have an object in memory. We'll just call it obj. And we've already seen that objects can have properties and methods. Like this obj has a property. Let's say it's property 1. And I can access it with obj.prop1 using the dot operator. The dot operator goes out and looks for a reference to something named prop1 and finds that in memory and gives it back to me, as long as it's referenced against obj. You've seen that already. We also know that the JavaScript engine adds hidden properties and methods to things, or properties and methods that we normally don't interact with directly. All objects in JavaScript, and that includes functions, all objects have a prototype property. The property is simply a reference to another object. We'll call it proto. It's an object that stands on its own. We could use it by itself if we wanted to. But the object property that we'll call proto, that's its prototype. That's the object that it's going to grab and be able to get its properties and methods as well. So if this other object, and it's just an object, has some other property, say prop2, when I call obj.prop2, the dot operator goes and looks for prop2 referenced on obj itself, and it doesn't find it. So it next goes to the prototype, there that object proto, and looks for that property name there. And if it finds it, it returns it. So it looks like prop2 is on our object, but it's actually on our object's prototype. Similarly, that prototype object itself can also point to another object, and so on and so forth. Each object can have its own prototype. And maybe this prototype of the prototype has another property, prop3. And so I use the dot operator to call obj.prop3. It doesn't find it in obj, so it looks at the prototype, that proto object. It doesn't find prop3 there, so it looks at the prototype of that object. And it finds prop3 and returns it, gives it to us. It looks like it's on our main object, but it's actually a ways down what's called the prototype chain. It looks like a chain, right? Don't confuse that with the scope chain, though it is kind of similar in some ways. The scope chain is about looking for where we have access to a variable. However, this has to do with where we have access to a property or method amongst a sequence of objects that are connected via this prototype property that we're calling here proto. And it's hidden from me in the sense that I don't have to go obj.proto.proto.prop3. I can just say obj.prop3. And the JavaScript engine does the work of searching the prototype chain for those properties and methods. The really interesting thing is if I have another object, let's say obj2, it can point to the same object as its prototype. It's just another object. These are just references. So objects can share all the same prototype if they want to, or if you want them to. And so if I call obj2.prop2, interestingly, that's going to return the exact same property, the same spot in memory, as obj.prop2. So they're literally sharing a property, but not directly. instead via this concept within the engine called the prototype chain. Prop2 isn't on obj and obj2. It's just that when the JavaScript engine goes down the chain to search, they happen to be pointing at the same place. Make sense? This is the prototype chain and the concept of prototypes, and it's very simple. Don't overthink it. It's just, I have this special reference in my object that says where to look for other properties and methods. That's my prototype. But I don't have to manually go .proto or something like that. I can just go .property or .method, and the JavaScript engine will go look for it down the chain. All right, let's see some examples. Let's say I have a person object, and I'm going to give this person object a first name, but I'm just going to call it default. This is a generic person, and the last name also default. And I'm going to give myself a property, or a method I should say, called getFullName that uses the first name and last name properties. We've done this before. All right, so there's my object person. It has two properties and a method. Now let's suppose I have another object called John. John has a first name John and a last name property Doe. Now I'm going to do something that you should never ever do. I know why. Well, we're going to talk quite extensively about the different ways to build objects and set the prototype. But for demonstration purposes and to explain this concept, the best way to explain this concept is to use a technique that you really should never use in real life. Because modern browsers do provide a way to directly access the prototype. But you don't want to use it. You don't want to set it because it's a performance problem. It can slow down your applications dramatically. So, I'm just going to put a comment here. Don't do this ever for demo purposes only. Okay. So I'll take my John object and I'll set the prototype. Again, don't ever do it this way, but it'll make it very easy to understand what's going on. Remember that all objects have a reference to another object, and we call that its prototype, where it goes and looks for properties and methods, if not found, on the original object. So, in most modern browsers, you can do this, __proto__. I know, weird, right? But that's to make sure you never accidentally type it. And you likely will never accidentally type __proto__, or accidentally name your own method or property that. It's really important to not mess this up. So even in the JavaScript language, they made sure that that was hard. So again, don't do this. But we're going to set the prototype of the John object to the person object. And that's all we have to do. John now inherits from person. In other words, the JavaScript engine, if I was to call a property or method, if I was to try to access a property and method on John that doesn't exist on John, it will go to person to try to find it. And if it's not on person, whatever persons.proto is, it will go and try to find it there, and on down the chain. So now that John's prototype points to person, I can just console.log john.getFullName. I couldn't do that before. There was no getFullName. So when I try to access getFullName, it will see that it's not there and look at the proto, and then look for it there, and it'll find it. So there it is, John Doe. Notice something else important. When this function is invoked, the execution context, when it creates the this variable, knows what object originally we're talking about. So this does not refer to person, it refers to John. Whatever object originated the call. Awfully useful, isn't it? So now I've just basically given access to this method of person. Now, if I console.log John.firstName, that property, I see John. Let's think about that. Why don't I get default? Well, because of the prototype chain. I'm asking for the first name property of the John object. And so it first looks at the John object for that property, and if it finds it, it returns it and stops. It doesn't search the prototype chain any further once it finds what I'm looking for. So this first name hides the first name on the prototype. Make sense? And that's only because the JavaScript engine starts at the top of the chain and works its way down and stops the first time it finds what it's looking for. All right, let's try something else. Let's add a new object, Jane. And Jane will just have a first name. No last name, just one name, like Beyonce or something. Jane. All right. So we'll set, remember, don't ever do this, but just to make it easy to understand what's going on, we'll set the Jane object's prototype to the same person object. So both of these protos, John's proto and Jane's proto, are pointing at the same spot in memory where this person object lives. So I can console.log Jane.getFullName. All right, now I want you to think about this. What am I going to see? The getFullName method returns this dot first name plus this dot last name. And whenever we request a property, it searches the prototype chain. And for starters, this, what is the this keyword going to be pointing to? It's going to be pointing at Jane. So it's going to search for first name and for last name on the Jane object and move down the prototype chain. Jane only has a first name property. So what will the Jane.getFullName return? You have an answer? Run it. Jane default. Is that what you guessed? Is that what you deduced? You're right. When it invokes getFullName, the this variable, the this keyword points to Jane because that object originated the call. And then it searches for first name on Jane, finds it, and says, okay, it's Jane. And then it searches for last name on the Jane object, doesn't find it, and looks at the prototype, which is person, and finds last name there. So we get Jane default. Make sense?